Africa's wealth, foreign greed, a story of endless exploitation. Africa's story is one of immense wealth, stolen potential, and a future still under siege. The tale of how foreign powers have plundered Africa's wealth and continue to do so is both terrifying and enraging. This is not a story from a distant past, but a nightmare that began centuries ago and continues unabated into the present. The initial chapter of this tale opens with the European colonization of Africa, marked by the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers carved up the continent like a piece of meat, with no regard for the people who lived there. The primary objective was to exploit Africa's vast resources: gold, diamonds, ivory, and human beings themselves. During the infamous transatlantic slave trade, millions of Africans were captured, enslaved, and shipped off to the Americas, fueling the rise of Western economies at the expense of African societies. But the tragedy didn't end with the abolition of slavery, it merely took on a new form. Colonialism, in all its brutal efficiency, turned Africa into a continent-wide resource extraction zone. From the mines of South Africa to the rubber plantations of Congo, European powers stripped the land of its riches. The British, French, Portuguese, Belgians, and others built railways, not to connect African cities for the benefit of its people, but to link resource-rich interiors with coastal ports, facilitating the transfer of wealth from Africa to Europe. In Ghana, for instance, the British constructed railways only to extract gold and cocoa, leaving the rest of the country's infrastructure underdeveloped. This pattern was repeated across the continent, where infrastructure served the narrow interests of colonial rulers rather than the needs of the people. As the 20th century progressed, the winds of change began to blow. African nations, one by one, fought for and gained independence. But true freedom remained elusive. The former colonial powers, unwilling to relinquish their grip, devised new ways to control African economies. Enter neocolonialism, a system where African nations were formally independent but economically enslaved. One of the most insidious tools of neocolonialism is debt. Western nations and financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank offered loans to newly independent African states. These loans came with strings attached, policies that prioritized the repayment of debt over the development of local economies. Countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and Zambia became trapped in a cycle of debt, where they were forced to pay more in interest than they could invest in education, healthcare, or infrastructure. This year, African nations are set to allocate $75 billion towards debt interest payments, a staggering sum that could otherwise be directed towards critical needs like social services and public infrastructure, as reported by the African Development Bank. But debt is just the tip of the iceberg. Multinational corporations, many headquartered in the West, have continued the plunder under the guise of legitimate business. These corporations extract billions of dollars worth of minerals, oil, and other resources every year, yet the profits rarely benefit the local populations. Instead, they are funneled back to shareholders in Europe, North America, and increasingly Asia. This modern-day pillaging has left Africa poorer, with countries losing more money through illicit financial flows than they receive in aid. This plunder is not only about money, it's about power and control. France, for example, has maintained its grip on its former colonies through the use of the CFA franc, a currency that is controlled by the French treasury. The colonial-era currency ensures that 14 African nations remain economically tethered to France, with limited control over their own financial policies. Even as African leaders speak of sovereignty and self-determination, the reality is that their economies are still under foreign control. But the plunder doesn't stop with Europe and the West. In recent decades, China has emerged as a new player in the scramble for Africa. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested billions in African infrastructure projects, from railways and ports to highways and power plants. On the surface, this might seem like a positive development, a way for Africa to build the infrastructure it desperately needs. But the reality is more complex. Many of these projects are financed through loans that African countries struggle to repay, leading to fears of a new kind of debt trap, where African nations might be forced to cede control of key assets, like ports and railways, to Chinese interests. Russia, too, has been expanding its influence in Africa, often through the backing of authoritarian regimes and military juntas. In countries like Sudan and the Central African Republic, Russia has provided military support in exchange for access to resources like gold and diamonds. This new scramble for Africa, driven by both old and new powers, is exacerbating conflicts and destabilizing regions that already are vulnerable. The effects of this ongoing exploitation are devastating. Africa is home to some of the world's richest deposits of minerals, yet it remains one of the poorest continents. The wealth generated from its resources is siphoned off by foreign corporations, corrupt local elites, and offshore tax havens, leaving behind environmental destruction, poverty, and inequality. The resource curse, a phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources tend to experience less economic growth and worse development outcomes, is painfully evident across Africa. Consider the case of the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, a country with an estimated $24 trillion in untapped mineral wealth. Despite this, the DRC remains one of the poorest and most conflict-ridden countries in the world. Multinational corporations, often with the complicity of local officials, have exploited the country's vast resources: cobalt, copper, gold, and diamonds, while contributing little to its development. The wealth generated from these resources leaves the country through illicit financial flows, enriching foreign elites while the Congolese people suffer in poverty. The situation is no different in Nigeria, where the Niger Delta, rich in oil, has become a symbol of environmental devastation and social unrest. Foreign oil companies, in collaboration with the Nigerian government, have extracted billions of dollars worth of oil from the region, yet the local population has seen little benefit. Instead, they're left with polluted lands, destroyed livelihoods, and government more interested in appeasing foreign interests than addressing the needs of its people. The looting of Africa is not just a crime of the past, it's an ongoing atrocity. As the world grapples with climate change, Africa is being forced to pay a disproportionate share of the costs, despite being one of the least responsible for the crisis. Climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts are draining resources from African economies, adding to the financial burden already imposed by debt and resource extraction. But there is hope. Across the continent, there is a growing recognition of the need for change. African leaders, civil society, and ordinary citizens are demanding an end to the plunder. They're calling for a new economic model that prioritizes the needs of the people over the profits of foreign corporations. There's a push for greater transparency, stronger regulations, and the repetition of stolen wealth. The fight against illicit financial flows, corruption, and tax evasion is gaining momentum, as is the demand for fair trade and investment practices that truly benefit African economies. Yet the road ahead is long and fraught with challenges. The forces arrayed against Africa are powerful, with deep pockets and a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But the tide is turning. The story of Africa is not just one of exploitation and despair. It's also a story of resilience, resistance, and the unyielding struggle for justice. The world must take notice. The exploitation of Africa is not just an African issue, it's a global one. The wealth that has been stolen from the continent has fueled the development of the West and now Asia, but it also contributed to the instability and suffering that we see in Africa today. If the world is to address global inequality, poverty, and conflict, it must start by addressing the exploitation of Africa. The time for change is now. Africa's future depends on it, and so does the future of the world.